Thanks, Adriana, and thanks to ICTSD for their hard work in making this possible. I think this is an excellent event, and looking forward to this session in particular. Now I'll get my stopwatch going so I know how badly I'm abusing my own time limits. The session grows out of work ISD and Entwine have done on trade and climate change, trade investment and climate change for some time. I guess I need to do a little bit of introduction on ISD, and I'll leave Mark to do some introduction on Entwine. ISD is, for those of you that don't know it, a non-governmental organization, a policy think tank based out of Winnipeg in Canada. We work across a number of areas, but the ones most relevant today are climate change and energy and trade and investment. That work's run out of our Geneva office. And we've been working in that area for some time. It's been, it's over a dozen years now, actually, since 1999 when we first started working in the area. The current work is supported by generous donations from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Norway and the Entwine Network. The panel we've got before us today, it's an exciting group of people. We've got myself, don't count myself among the exciting ones. I'm Senior Advisor and Associate at International Institute for Sustainable Development. We have Jacob Worksman, Director of Institutions and the Governance Program at the World Resources Institute. Mark Sanctuary, who's Program Director at the Entwine Network of Researchers funded by the Mistra Foundation in Sweden. Peter Wooders, also of my institute, Senior Climate Change Economist based out of our Geneva office. And Pete Dupuy, who's the Program Manager for Sustainable Growth Trade at the Trade Industrial Policy Secretariat, TIPS, here in South Africa. I want to, before I do my main presentation, ramble for a bit. I hope you'll humor me. I want to set the discussion in some kind of context. Most of the discussion from the panelists is going to be on the subject of border carbon adjustment. We've heard something about it in many of the previous presentations. But I want to set that in the context of the wider context of trade as a response measure to climate change. And to begin that context setting, I want to make some very brief observations, and you've probably heard this before, on the similarities between the current frustration and progress between climate change and trade spheres. Both negotiations are more or less stalled as far as I'm concerned. I won't go into the details of either because I assume most of you are familiar with them, but to look at the underlying roots, we have a process that involves unresolved tensions between the commitments of developed countries and developing countries. What is the fair proportion of burden that each should bear, and what kind of special treatment are we going to give to developing countries? We have the waters muddied by a picture which includes not just developed and developing anymore, but fast emerging countries like China, India, and the other BRICS, which defy easy definition. We have more fundamentally the inability of both the trade and the climate change community to sell the urgency of their case to a domestic audience, which makes it hard for policymakers to take urgent action. So the trade community has more or less failed to sell to a wide public the value of unilateral action on trade and trade openness, so that the publics of most countries believe that unilateral liberalization is more or less a surrender to foreign competitors. In the same sense, in the climate change community, we've failed to sell the urgency of the science and the need for action to a public which believes that that kind of action is necessary in its own long-term interests. And therefore, neither in the trade context nor in the climate change context do politicians have the kind of domestic support that lets them take radical and unilateral action. If we add to this the context of the present financial crisis, we have a situation in which politicians trying to take action on climate change have to sell it as action on climate change and the economy, a movement toward a green economy, the engine of growth that they see in the future. All of these drivers lead us to a situation in which we have increasingly likely resort by domestic governments to unilateral trade-related response measures. Now, these measures are controversial from a number of perspectives. They're controversial from the trade setting, because in many cases they seem to violate WTO or investment treaty rules. So, for example, you have Japan complaining that Canada has has attached domestic content requirements to its feed-in tariffs in Ontario, and complaining that that's an illegal subsidy under WTO rules. It's currently working its way through the process. You have a recent case against China and another one pending on a restriction of exports, which on its face, according to China, was an environmental measure, designed to reduce the energy intensity of its economic production, but in fact, the panel has ruled that it was actually a protectionist measure. You have the use in China and other countries of export credit for renewable energy industries, which is really focused on developing a domestic sector, but the question is it WTO legal? You have free allocation of allowances under cap and trade regimes, which most legal analysts conclude is a WTO actionable and in fact not prohibited, but a subsidy which would not pass WTO rules. These kinds of measures are also controversial in the climate change context. And they seem to violate, among other things, the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. So we have border carbon adjustment, which seeks to level the playing field between developed country producers and developing country producers without taking into account the fact that we have historical responsibilities, we have different capacities, we have the commitments that were made in Rio. You have aviation levies, which amount to the same thing, which are trying to level a playing field at some developed country level. You have low carbon fuel standards, which demand that, which shut out imports of fuel that were produced in ways that have higher carbon content than domestic content. These are about to go in place in several jurisdictions in North America. Carbon footprint labeling. There are a number of ways in which the trade issues work their influence in the agricultural negotiations in the WTO as well. And I have a paper which I've neglected to put on the table out there, but soon will. In any case, trade, as we all know in this context, is a controversial issue in the climate change context as well. And in other contexts, one of the key issues, the negotiating issue in Rio +20 is green protectionism. It comes up again and again and again in the context of how to pursue a green economy in the context of sustainable development and poverty alleviation. But those kinds of measures, controversial as they are an inevitable consequence of the drivers I talked about, of the failure of the multilateral processes on trade and climate change, and the move to try to create green economies domestically. And we'll see more and more of it. It's not a flash in the pan. The US and China have only just begun to fight. More fights are on the horizon. The US is investigating Chinese subsidies in other areas. China has initiated a counter-investigation on US subsidization of polysilicon, a key ingredient in PV solar. So we're going to see a lot more of this. At the end of the day, though, we've got all these measures that are trade restrictive and worrisome from that perspective. And I haven't even talked much about subsidies. We have them all. They're all being used. But what we do not have is international consensus on where their use is appropriate. Yes, we have trade rules that we can use to come to bear on those things. You can, in fact, take border carbon adjustment to the dispute settlement mechanism if you want, and you'll get a result. But that's not a good idea, I put it to you. First, because this is not the kind of dispute where we're trying to decide whether a country has or hasn't broken rules that we all agree on. This is the kind of a dispute where countries don't agree on the fundamental rules. They don't agree on what is appropriate behavior. It's a first legal principle that you shouldn't take those kinds of disputes to a court. They should be politically decided, number one. And number two, the fact that we don't know ex ante what's legal and what's not legal is hard for policymakers in countries. They don't know what kinds of policy options they have available to them. We have no international consensus on whether border carbon adjustment is appropriate, on whether certain forms of carbon footprint labeling are appropriate. We just don't know what kinds of subsidies are appropriate. We don't have that international agreement. And in the context of a situation where we don't know and where everybody's doing it, you have two options. One is to let the dispute settlement system decide, and I think that would be very bad for the dispute settlement system itself. It would be corrosive for the WTO. There's no good outcome to taking an issue like that to the WTO. Or you can talk about it and figure out what's appropriate. And when I say talk about it, I mean, first and foremost, figure out what is effective. What is an effective use of a border carbon adjustment measure? Are domestic content requirements effective environmentally? And here, I don't think there's any environmental economic tension at all. If it's effective environmentally, it is also, if it's effective environmentally, it's also good economically. If it's ineffective environmentally, if it doesn't achieve its environmental goals, then you could have achieved just as good a result, a better result, by importing the technology and not requiring that it be produced domestically. So the key question is, what's effective policy? At the end of the day, I think the law has to reflect what we decide as an international community is effective or is not effective. But where do you have that discussion? Where do we decide what's appropriate, what's effective? Where can we examine the evidence on what's appropriate and what's effective? It can't really be done in the WTO. We all know that the WTO Doha round has been stalled for some time. It can't really be done in the UNFCCC. It's not a trade negotiating forum. And anyway, we've seen how far we've come with negotiations in the UNFCCC. We need some kind of an institutional space to talk about these issues. Maybe it's a permanent forum on response measures under the UNFCCC. Maybe it's something else, but I don't think it's going to happen within the existing institutions. Most of the rest of the session is going to be spent talking about border carbon adjustment, and one of the key examples of ways in which you can find that institutional space outside the system is an initiative we undertook in concert with a number of other actors. How do I actually move this thing forward? Sorry. How do I get to the next slide? There we go. With a number of other institutions, we tried to elaborate what is good practice in elaborating and implementing border carbon adjustment. We started from the proposition that this is more or less guidance on least worst practice. We would rather not see border carbon adjustment. We'd rather have a nice multilateral agreement. But the problem is we probably won't see that anytime soon. So we had this small group drafting what I thought would take a couple of afternoons, but has in fact taken a couple of years. I'm going to run through a quick description of what we've come out with, and some of the other speakers are going to elaborate on that guidance as well. But just starting points, as I said, we would rather have a multilateral solution, and that BCAs are strictly to be regarded as a fallback measure, a second best measure, maybe worse than second best. I'm going to assume we all know what I'm talking about when we talk about border carbon adjustment. Mark Sanctuary is going to go into some of the motivations for border carbon adjustment. I'll just skip over them here. You can have the motivation of preventing leakage. You can have the motivation of protecting competitiveness. You can have the motivation of trying to lever other countries into some kind of climate change action. Our conclusion was that leverage is really the only legitimate exercise, only legitimate objective for climate change purposes. The others are more or less industrial policy. The first thing the guidance has to go through is what kind of exemptions you're going to have at the national level for what countries are covered. You could have exemptions for countries that are party to a multilateral agreement, as Waxman-Markey did. You could have exemptions for LDCs and low-income countries. So the chart you see here goes through a number of the different criteria that could be used to rate what exceptions you use. We came out with, I'm sorry I'm running through this. We came out with the following exemptions. Countries with a national emissions cap should be exempted because there's no way that leakage can occur to such a country. Even if in a particular sector you have leakage at a national level, you will not have leakage. There's a cap. By definition, you can't have leakage to such a country. Countries taking adequate national actions, and we leave it to others to define what that national action is that could be adequate other than a cap. Sectors covered by a cap, obviously you can't experience leakage to that. And we recommend that LDCs be given some kind of an exemption as well, as long as you can solve the problem of transshipment through LDCs. And of course, sectors are goods that fall below a de minimis level of imports. Then you need to decide what goods are going to be covered. And the example of the iPhone was used in the previous session. That's definitely not one of the goods that's going to be covered. We're talking here about a very small handful of goods, energy-intensive, trade-exposed goods. You basically got the usual suspects. It's iron and steel, or steel, aluminum, cement, some chemicals, pulp and paper maybe glass. It's a very small group, and they're basic commodities. They're not manufactured goods. Okay? The danger is in an overly broad coverage. The EU's coverage of vulnerable sectors is a good warning example of how that shouldn't be done. But anyway, the criteria you want to use are they should have a high cost of energy, so they should be impacted by climate change negotiations or climate change regulations, and they should not be able to pass those costs through to consumers. In other words, they should actually take a hit. They should be highly traded. A highly traded good can't pass the costs through because if you impose those costs, its trade competitors from other countries can come in and fill the void when their costs increase. Peter is going to talk a little bit about how you determine the actual benchmarks and the levels of adjustment, so I'll leave that to him. Just to say that we basically, the recommendation is the foreign importers, the foreign producers should have to provide data telling us how carbon intensive their goods are, or if they are unable or unwilling to do that, then we assign them a benchmark, a default benchmark that they can go back to. So in that sense, they're accorded no less favorable treatment than domestic producers, which also have to provide data. Finally, what do you do with the money you get? We recommended that you don't keep it. There are a number of options you can use. So you can give it back to the countries on which you've assessed it. You can put it into an international fund that tries to address climate change mitigation and adaptation. You can put it into your own national fund that does the same thing. Any of those are good. Keeping it is not good. Any of those help to demonstrate that really you're serious about common but differentiated responsibility and climate change objectives. We also have a long and very boring list of institutional structure, nice housekeeping governance things that are mostly based on the TBT, transparency, openness, predictability, applicability, that sort of thing. Where to from here? This set of guidance is currently a draft, but basically almost complete. We'll be distributing it further to the public after a little more elaboration from the small group, trying to get buy-in on it. Ultimately, we hope that it becomes a reference point for governments that are trying to put these things in place or considering whether to put these things in place, because after seeing what kind of detail you have to go into, maybe you want to decide that that's not a good idea. Or used as a benchmark by those countries that are going to be affected by border carbon adjustment to measure schemes that are going to be applying to them. Thanks. I'll now pass it over to the rest of our presenters. We'll start with Jake Worksman, who's going to give us another sort of a context-setting presentation. Jake.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much to the organizers, ICTSD and Entwine, for the opportunity to address you today on this very important issue. I think if you take what governments are saying on the other side of town at its face value, at their word, we know that at least within the politics of the UNCCC, that it is widely accepted that we all must do something and do something urgently to combat climate change. But as Aaron suggested, we have not decided yet is who should be doing what, how much, and how quickly. And while I think that the values and the interests that are being debated on the other side of town are far more complex and subtle than you might have gotten the impression of from the previous panel, there is no doubt that there is still a lot of tension around these issues of who should do what and how quickly, and tension that arises around issues of the intersections between trade and environment. So we're in this world where we don't have clear multilaterally agreed standards around these issues. We haven't agreed how much the United States should be doing, how much China should be doing, whether Europe is doing enough. And therefore, we've moved into this context where we're moving into a transitional period where the Kyoto Protocol first commitment period is lapsing. The Framework Convention process hasn't yet been able to replace it. A period that people characterize as being more bottom-up in its character, so that it is each country that is defining for itself how quickly it will move, how ambitious it will be. And we're essentially looking at a multi-track system as a result of that. If you begin to scan across the pledges that are contained in the Cancun agreements, you'll see that the pace at which countries are moving are very different from each other. So that difference in regulation means that there will be differences of costs that different economies are incurring as a result of taking action or not taking action with regard to climate change. And therefore, we find ourselves in the context in which significant trade tensions might emerge. But these trade tensions are based essentially upon countries' policy choices that eventually evolve in the form of measures that are applied to specific policies and specific services. And what we see is that rather there being one ideological response that says a free market is the optimal response and we must rely upon it alone to deliver the solutions until we can all agree on a single global solution. Or on the other hand, that climate change alone must prevail as the overriding priority for the international community, and countries are free to act with the use of unilateral trade measures in order to advance that objective. Rather than either of those two being the actual discourse, we see that in practice, all governments are using trade measures of one sort or another to advance different policy objectives, whether it's in climate change context or other contexts. And it really is on a product-by-product, service-by-service, measure-by-measure basis that countries selectively choose to complain, to take a WTO dispute, for example, when it hits a particular national concern. So it's a much more confusing landscape than I think we were exposed to as a result of the previous panel. In that context, I wanted to say a little bit about border carbon adjustments and to elaborate a bit further on what Aaron described as the different ranges of policy motivations that countries have articulated when they have proposed putting border carbon adjustments in place, and to give a range of perspectives, primarily from the importing country that has put that measure in place, and those of the exporting country that is potentially challenge that measure once it's in place. And this will give you a sense, I think, a little bit more subtle sense of what's going on in the politics, both across the street, but also potentially at the WTO. As Aaron said, one of the concerns that you see reflected in border carbon adjustments within some of the more recent climate legislation, proposed and otherwise, is this policy objective or motivation of addressing competitiveness, where the importer is essentially saying that energy-intensive, trade-exposed industries merit protection from producers of the same or similar products from low-standard countries. Of course, from an exporter perspective, particularly if that's a developing country that hasn't yet put in place significant climate legislation, those lower standards that they have in place are in part based on this UNFCCC principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capability, and therefore it is, in trade terms, a justifiable comparative advantage for them continuing to have a relatively low cost of production. With regard to reducing emissions leakage, this concern that the environmental effectiveness of a climate policy will be undermined if investments or supply chains related to a regulated industry shift to lower standard countries. The importer's perspective is that is a justification for adjusting at the border. But of course, for a lower standard country that might not be under the same kind of international obligation to reduce its emissions, that lower standard is also seen to be consistent with this right to development and therefore consistent with this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Finally, with regard to that third policy justification of leveraging policy change, where the importing country is limiting access to its markets in order to coerce or encourage its trading partner to undertake more ambitious climate policies. Again, from the exporting country perspective, the use of market power to coerce policy change would be inconsistent with their sovereignty, their sovereign choice, and also this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. So that, I think, is a more subtle way of explaining where the landscape of perspectives is at the moment in terms of these different policy motivations and where the importers and and exporters perceive these different policies as being justifiable or as not being justifiable. This is part of a much longer running debate on the relationship between climate policy and trade policy, only part of which is played out at the international level. I thought I would run very quickly through that, again, to give a bit of a richer context in which the current debate rests. For those of you who have been following this, as some of us have since the early 1990s, you know that the Framework Convention itself anticipated that in order to advance the objectives of that convention, individual parties might need to put in place unilateral trade measures. And so this provision, which was based in part on the experience of implementing other multilateral environmental agreements that did successfully use trade measures in a way that was generally conceived as being a fair and effective use of border measures, this principle was put in place to reflect that possibility, but also to ensure that those measures were disciplined by the principles that we are all familiar with from the GATT itself, that essentially ensure that unilateral trade measures don't constitute a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination or a disguised restriction on international trade. So again, both developed and developing countries contemplated this possibility early on and recognized that governments may, in their role as responsible governments, need to interfere with the market to indeed put in place unilateral trade measures, but if they did so, they had to do so in a way that was disciplined. The second conversation that we've had at the international level about climate change and trade, I won't dwell on at all, but since the previous panel also mentioned that there was this what they called an artificial market established around carbon. Well, it actually is quite a functioning market, at least within the European Union, and now in Australia as well. We'll see it emerge. There were some questions raised as to whether these things that were being created within this market, these allowances and these offsets generated by essentially cap and trade regimes, linking up cap and trade regimes, would trigger the application of WTO rules and the efforts by some importing countries to screen out what they might consider low-quality offsets or allowances would be considered potentially a WTO violative trade measure that would be distinguishing between otherwise like allowances or offsets on the basis of, for example, the kinds of policies that were in place in the country of origin of those allowances or offsets. But the next chapter really became as the Kyoto Protocol came into force and the European Union and others began to put into place some significant response measures that had the potential, not through the use of trade measures, but by simply affecting the costs of goods and services, have an impact on trade. And this debate about whether even those measures, not trade measures, but simply measures that affected market share and market costs, might need to trigger a response in terms of compensation or other forms of policies that would help those countries that were losing market share as a result of the higher costs of fossil fuels, for example, might need a policy response of some kind from the international system. It was then when I think that the European Union moved into the second phase of its EU ETS, and the United States began to contemplate an erstwhile bill once known as Waxman-Markey, which would have been an economy-wide cap on U.S. emissions, that the border carbon adjustment debate that we are now trying to seek some resolutions to really arose with some seriousness. And I'm going to leave the other panelists to talk about the details of that. But this really did help to sharpen what had been largely an academic debate, somewhat of an abstract debate, into something that seemed much more serious and imminent in terms of the types of tensions that might arise and the potential disputes that might arise. What we're seeing today, prior to those border carbon adjustments having been put in place, is the kind of bilateral trade disputes that you might anticipate would arise in essentially a multilateral vacuum of the kind that Aaron described, where we haven't made a lot of progress in developing multilateral rules either within the trade system or within the UNFCCC, and therefore we are seeing disputes arising, particularly at the WTO, with regard to particular climate policies that are put in place that potentially might violate one or more WTO rules. So in conclusion, and justification of why it is that groups like WRI and IASD and Entwined and ICTSD undertake this issue so seriously, is because in this space there is definitely a need for policy relevant and responsive research that can help to guide the resolution of disputes in the absence of the emergence of clearly negotiated rules that might help countries design measures in such a way that might avoid conflicts with WTO rules while still advancing climate change objectives. Or in the context of a dispute arising, helping a panel understand, or the appellate body understand, under what principles that dispute might fairly and effectively be resolved between parties. So really this is an effort to bridge two sets of values. The sets of values I think that were very accurately and well represented by the previous panel, which again seemed to place free trade as being the end-all and be-all of what government's responsibilities are with regard to each other. And the kinds of values I think that are hopefully being reflected by the negotiations that are down the street that recognize that preventing dangerous climate change is at least an equally important public good that governments have a responsibility to try to contribute solutions towards. So the rest of the panel is going to be elaborating in more detail at least what we've been able to come up with in terms of a set of principles that might help to bridge those two sets of values in a way that we hope as many people will perceive as being fair and effective and responsive both to the concerns about economic growth as well as the needs to address global climate change. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here and to join in this panel. So I've been introduced. My name is Mark Sanctuary. I'm the program director for Entwined. And I think the name Entwine has been bounced around a bit, so I thought I'd just take 2 minutes to explain who it is that is participating in Entwine, and just so you're reassured on where we're coming from. So Entwine is a research program, and our vision is to change the way for the better we manage trade and environment. And we do this by doing 2 things. One is by conducting cutting-edge, world-class research, and then the second is by engaging with people who work with implementation. And we work at the intersection of economics, political science, and law, and response measures are a key component of our work program. If you want to know more about Entwine, we have a website, and you can find more details on entwine.se. All right, so today my presentation is going to be about border carbon adjustments, and the three objectives of border carbon adjustments are usually mentioned along with. The first is, as Aaron and Jake pointed out, punishment, and then there's leakage, and there's competitiveness. And I'm coming at this from very much an economics point of view, and I'll be the first one to admit that there's a lot more than just economics that makes the world go round. So I hope that you'll take what I'm saying as just an aspect to some of these problems. Okay, so let's start with punishment. What do we know? What does the research, state of research say about what punishment can do to get countries to leverage a stronger or more ambitious climate deal? So in this way, border carbon adjustments would function very much in the same way that standard sanctions would function. And there's quite a lot, there's a large body of literature on the role of sanctions, especially in the political science literature. So the effectiveness of sanctions is a bit of a mixed bag. It's not clear that they're always effective, but one thing that we can take from the political science literature is that the success of a sanction depends partly on the power of the threat, the size of your stick, and then also on the credibility of your threat. So let's look at those 2 aspects in turn. So what level of threat would you need in order to get dirty exporting countries to sign on to a more robust climate deal? So there's some recent research, very useful research that came out just a year ago, and all these references I'll make available if you want to come up and talk to me afterwards. And they examine what level of tariff you would need to impose in order to get the BRIC countries to sign on to a more robust climate deal. And they find that you would need enormously high tariffs in order to get any kind of traction in this regard. Tariffs of several hundred%. And even higher if it was only OECD countries that were leveraging tariffs on BRIC countries. So that's not such good news for the size of the stick that you would need, because border carbon adjustments do not approach that, or at least what's been discussed so far anyways. So the second point is, how credible is this threat? So there's not really any direct research on this, but I think something that's really worthwhile noting is that the trading regime is incredibly interconnected. So it's not just finished goods that are being produced in one country and then traded into another region. So for example, if we look at exports from China, there was a recent paper that was done on how much of Chinese exports are actually made in China, and the figure is about 50%. Now it's probably different if you start looking at energy-intensive, trade-exposed sectors. Might be higher, might be lower, but if you're going to start restricting trade for climate from BRIC countries, you're probably also going to be punishing your own export sector. You're going to be, in one way or another, maybe shooting yourself in your own foot. So in this way, might undermine the credibility of the threat of using BCAs as a way of punishing non-compliant countries. Okay, so a second motivation, leakage. So how big is this problem? And before I go into discussing how big this problem is and how effective BCAs are, I want to just take a minute to explain what leakage is, because I think there's often when I discuss this issue with a lot of people, I hear that there's some confusion on this concept. So leakage is the response abroad in terms of increase of emissions to a tightening of emissions at home. So you push it home on your climate, and the problem pops up somewhere else. It's that dynamic effect that's leakage. It's not absolute levels of carbon in different countries. So maybe some of you have seen this picture, and I want to explain that this is not leakage. So here, this was in The Economist a couple of months ago, and people were saying, oh look, since 1990, Europe's climate change efforts have been completely undone by imports of carbon. So you see that they domestically, or in Europe has reduced its carbon emissions, but when you calculate how much has been imported, it's been completely undone. This is not leakage. This is just the fact that different countries have different technologies and different emissions intensities. So keep that in mind. Going back to leakage. Okay, so how big is this problem? So there's several channels through which leakage can occur. One is through the relocation of production, and this is what I think most people have in mind when they talk about leakage. You could close up shop in one country because it's too expensive to emit, and you open up shop somewhere else where it's cheaper. Another channel of leakage, which actually many studies point to as being the most important source of leakage, is what happens on energy markets. So let's say Europe undertakes ambitious climate regulation and demand for oil drops. That makes it cheaper for countries outside Europe to consume oil, and bang, you got leakage. So overall estimates for leakage point to the fact that the overall effects on the economy are quite small. But for a few energy-intensive, trade-exposed sectors, the effects of leakage can be quite large. And these are usually, energy-intensive, trade-exposed sectors are usually iron, steel, cement, chemicals, and non-ferrous metals and such things. Okay, so what can we say about BCA effectiveness on addressing leakage? Well, if you put a border carbon adjustment on imports of carbon-intensive goods in trade-exposed sectors, well, then you're going to address leakage. A lot of the research points to this. Makes sense. But another point that's made is that this is a very, very costly way of dealing with leakage. It would be much more effective economically if you subsidized abatement in the dirty exporting country. So I want to add a footnote here, and this goes back to the common but differentiated responsibilities. Countries acting unilaterally are going to price carbon differently. So any difference between countries, common but differential responsibilities, goes beyond just the fact that we have historical emissions, we have different responsibilities. If you look at any difference between countries, that would result in a different choice in pricing carbon. Difference in population, difference in the environment, in geography, in industry structure, not to mention levels of development or income. Even countries that are equally engaged or care equally about climate change will probably regulate the climate very differently. So there's a few observations that fall directly from this. First of all, as I said, this is what's underlying the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. This idea also underlines a lot of other multilateral agreements. And then second, one of the reasons that we trade is because of these differences. So does it make sense to adjust for these differences? Do you really level the playing field if you're adjusting for the difference in carbon policy between nations? In many ways, it doesn't make sense. So let's go to competitiveness then. So this was something that the Nobel Prize winning economist recently won the prize. Paul Krugman wrote for his. He was recognized for his contribution to international economics. And he wrote this in '94 in response to the US trade deficit with Japan at the time. And I think it's, well, of course he's right, but he didn't have climate in mind when he wrote this. And I think that before I go into looking at competitiveness and BCA's effectiveness on addressing competitiveness, I just want to explain what he meant. So first of all, his point was that competitiveness is a concept that works very much at the level of the firm, but it does not work at the national level. So countries like the US, China, and Europe, they don't compete on international markets in the same way that Pepsi and Coke compete. For example, and contrary to competition between firms, if things are going well for Europe, that means it's probably going well for the US or for China. If things are going badly for Europe, if Europe's in the dumps, this isn't good for the US economy or for China. And you can see that kind of that worry being propagated now with the crisis in Greece. So this isn't a zero-sum game. So you often hear this idea that, well, climate policy is going to increase the cost of production, and this is going to affect the competitiveness of our economy. But the cost of production and a country's competitiveness, they're two very different things. They're different. They're not the same thing at all. If we look at labor laws, they often result in a higher cost of labor. And a lot of the countries that have the toughest labor laws are also ranked among the most competitive economies in the world. It's the same thing with environmental regulation. If you have strict environmental regulation, you're probably also ranked as one of the most competitive economies of the world. So this idea that increasing the cost of competitiveness, increasing the cost of production harms your competitiveness doesn't add up. And you can easily illustrate this with an example of how you can come up with policies that are pro-growth, pro-jobs, and good for the environment, but harmful for a company's profit. So the point I want to make here is that a BCA will probably be effective at protecting the profit of a collection of a few firms, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's good for the overall economic competitiveness of to use that term wrongly, of a nation. So that should be taken into consideration when you're talking about this issue of competitiveness. Thanks, that's my presentation.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for your attention. Aaron very helpfully at the beginning of this session said that we have developed a set of guidelines that are close to publication on BCAs and how they should be implemented if a country was minded to do so. We're not going to get into the issue today about, or within this presentation at least, about whether a country should or shouldn't put in a BCA, but we're saying if they wanted to put in a BCA now, quite quickly, what are some of the practical suggestions that we can give and some guidance around that? Aaron also, who's chatting away at the moment, also much less helpfully stole my entire punchline at the end of my presentation, so I'll punish him for that later. So, assessing the level of charges under a BCA regime, some of the work we've done in support of these BCA guidelines. And again, this is about if somebody wants to implement a BCA now, they have to assess foreign carbon content now. Aaron's got a slightly older version of the presentation here, unfortunately. Aaron? We've got an older version of the presentation. If somebody wants to implement a BCA now, they need to assess carbon content now. Bottom bit pops up here, perfect is the enemy of the good. And I want to talk today particularly to this issue of assessing foreign carbon content. This assessment needs to be accurate enough, representative of the actual carbon content, and not too low to miss most of the carbon. And some of the proposals that have been made would be too low to miss most of the carbon, and therefore would make the BCA in effect ineffective. They need to rely on data that is available or is quickly available. They need to be fair between countries and producers, and they shouldn't be subject to multiple legal challenges. These are all general principles about what needs to happen. So, we're looking at assessing the foreign carbon content. There are two choices here. Do we ask foreign producers who are bringing goods into our country as regulated by the BCA, do we ask them to provide data that shows the carbon content of those goods, or do we apply some benchmarks to those goods otherwise? First point to make is that for the domestic producers, we're not arguing here for benchmarks at all. Domestic producers must provide data assessing the carbon content of their commodities using established protocols and so on as possible. For foreign producers, and again skipping to the end of this, what we would say is that there seems to be an order. Do we say to a foreign producer, you will be subject to a certain benchmark, or do we say you need to provide data that gives your carbon content of your commodity? We say the first request should be, and this is equivalent, this is exactly the same as you're asking your domestic producer, please provide the data that shows what the carbon content of your commodity is, and that data should be subject to third-party verification as usual. Relying on that data, though, from all producers in all countries for all commodities that are subject could obviously lead to an enormous delay. So if there isn't that data available, if it's not being able to supply, then a benchmark should be applied. And the big question is, of course, what level should that benchmark be? We went through a set of considerations here. Number one, and you see this sometimes in the literature, is that people say there are differences in national averages for a commodity such as steel or cement or something like that from particular countries. This could work if we could maintain that production had distinct national differences and drivers of these commodities, and if the data were available. On the direct emissions side, so emissions from burning fossil fuels and from fugitive emissions and so on, the data available at this kind of national average level is simply too simple. And if anyone wanted to challenge that, or if any producer would say that doesn't apply to me, it would be very, very easy for them to do. That data isn't collected to any consistent formats, it isn't collected to any protocols, it isn't verified, it's just far too simple. So, too easy to challenge. Beyond that, though, on the electricity side, we can derive national electricity averages for countries, emissions factors. The data's all there in IEA energy balances and otherwise. And we recommend that, because that data is available, that would be the best approach for a benchmarking approach. For estimating the carbon from imported products on the electricity side, yes, we can use national specific factors, and yes, they are available. So we would recommend that. Some pictures now coming up to break this up, hopefully. We did some work recently on the steel sector about emissions reduction potential within the steel sector, and it sort of answers the question about how national are production differences. And there are basically 4 ways to reduce emissions from steel. Firstly, you shut down your very small, very inefficient blast furnaces. This is an example of a blast furnace you can put in your garden to make bullets, if you should so desire. And more seriously, there are a lot of small backstreet hearths and what have you in the steel sector in China, India and other countries. Shutting those down would reduce some emissions. It's a one-off gain. Secondly, picture of another Chinese scene from some time ago. There are improvements that could be made at existing plants through investments. We can reduce our intensity of steel production by recycling and using scrap steel. Unfortunately, for that option, basically all the world's steel is already, or virtually all the world's steel is already recycled, so there isn't an environmental gain to be had from that. And then finally, countries can put in brand new facilities. Each country will have a mix of these plants. It will differ by country, and it will differ how much scrap they've got available to them at the moment. And it's that mix of plants that drives their average, not particularly that they are better or worse at producing steel. And so a national average disguises a lot of detail below, which, as I'll come on to, it doesn't seem to be very useful to use that average, and it isn't helpful to any of these individual producers from any of those 4 groups. Where this leads us to next is, what about then a benchmark as a best available technology? And I've got here in the table for 3 major commodities, cement, steel and aluminium, what would be the bottom of the range and the top of the range in terms of ton CO2 per ton of product for those commodities. The cement one is somewhere between 0.5 and 1.2 from the very best to the very worst, and it's driven by the rate of blending, by the technology, by the use of biomass and by the size. But steel and aluminium have got much, much wider ranges, basically because you've got the option of recycling product. So steel, you can put in scrap into an electric arc furnace. If that electric arc furnace electricity for that electric arc furnace comes from a 0 carbon source, then you've got 0 carbon coming out of steel production, and the same for aluminium. But on the converse, if you've got a very old blast furnace, a very small one, like some of the drawing from the picture below, you might get up to 3.5 tons of CO2 per ton of product for steel. Aluminium, even more, you might get up to 18 tons CO2 per ton of steel if all the electricity for that steel was from coal-fired power generation, and if all that aluminium was coming from the primary route. Primary smelting activity is about 20 times more energy intense than the recycling route. I think what you get very much from this table is that there are very significant process differences. If we look at steel, we've got an electric arc furnace and a modern blast furnace, and a blast furnace. They are different, fundamentally different. Putting some sort of best available technology or average around those isn't very helpful. And aluminium, similarly, the two issues there are you recycling and where's your electricity coming from? So our conclusion from this sort of analysis is that best available technology isn't very helpful, at least if there's one best available technology for an entire sector. So where do we get to? Benchmark option 3 then becomes a process benchmark. We set a benchmark for an electric arc furnace. We set a benchmark for a blast furnace. We can use national electricity factors already. We've talked about that on the indirect side. And we think that using process benchmarks for the direct emissions is a better way forward. When would you use these multiple benchmarks then? There needs to be some sort of choice here. Firstly, is there a material difference in the emissions by process? Steel and aluminium seems to say yes. Cement, if you were going to do a benchmark on cement, it might be better to look at the amount of blending material that was in the particular cement rather than saying it's from a particular type of process. That's a bigger determinant of the difference in emissions. And it has to be practical to test for this difference. We heard some comments earlier about rules of origin and various other things. What could actually happen at the border such that you could test and say, this steel comes from this sort of plant and this aluminium comes from that sort of plant. Next question we have is if you, as the country or the region who's going to set your border carbon adjustment benchmark, should you set it at your best level, at some sort of best level, at an average level, or some sort of worst level? And our proposal is it should be at the worst level. So if we're thinking about a steel is arriving into your regulated region, then let's assume that steel firstly is from a blast furnace, because then the onus is on the person who's bringing it in to prove that it's not. And then let's assume that it's from a badly performing plant. In general, probably most of those badly performing plants won't be exporting, but they might be. And if it is the worst possible plant benchmark or a bad level benchmark, this provides the incentives for the organisers, the producers then to submit some data, and it's most effective at preventing leakage. It avoids the free rider issue. And these are ideas. We're very, very happy to discuss these in the discussion section coming up next. How might we take this forward and next steps? Our proposals are not yet fully developed, but I think we're pretty happy with where they are methodologically and where they are in terms of choice. Distinguishing by process looks to be the best approach. We need to extend this into detailed designs. There aren't that many sectors to do in reality. If we as a research community sit down and spend some time next year doing steel, doing cement, and doing aluminium, we're more or less there. We don't have to get into iPods or anything like that. Consulting with key industry groups, groups like the Cement Sustainability Initiative, the World Steel Association, and so on, have been collecting very good quality plant level emissions data for several years, and they're experienced in how those how that sort of operation should be set up and the sort of protocols you should use. They use typically WRI, WBCSD protocol, which is fit for purpose in our view. We would like other researchers and modelers to put the proposals we put into their models and see what comes out. And we've skipped over a bit today, and I think this will probably come out in the discussion, some of the legal issues that might come up from this and the possible needs for capacity building. One of the hopefully the positive externalities of this sort of approach is by asking exporters or importers to put data together on their carbon content of their products, then their capacity will be built such that they can do that in the future and that a better data set comes up which is more useful for everyone. So that's our idea on the sort of data or benchmarking question, and like I say, very happy to discuss that with you in the session now or later on. Thank you for your attention.
Hi.
Piet de Plooy from South Africa, Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies. I've heard that acronym abused all sorts of ways, but I think that tip for the future, use a shorter name. I'm going to play the role of respondent on a lot of these issues and add perhaps a bit of South African flavor. So there's no PowerPoint, you can relax. And I'm going to do it in a slightly odd order, but I want to make all these points, and let's see where it goes towards the end. An interesting one, I think, in terms of Mark's presentation was this idea of using border carbon adjustments as sanctions, and that it isn't very effective necessarily. I say interesting because the South African experience has been slightly different. TIPS works very closely with the Department of Trade and Industry. We were created way back when in order to support and provide policy support and research to the department. And it's been our experience, and I work very closely on green industries and specifically with the department, and it was our experience that even though the numbers weren't clearly known, the very threat of border carbon adjustments was something that ignited a fire under the department, and people started paying attention. The threat to our competitiveness, before it was qualified, really got action going. Subsequently, there's been some research done, and the research suggests that at moderate levels of carbon pricing or moderate levels of border carbon adjustment, the impact on competitiveness wouldn't be massive. Especially, it would be even further moderated if developing countries participated in a global trading system. And all in all, even our steel sector needn't be necessarily affected severely by border carbon adjustments. And that's what the findings have shown us. To an extent, as an environmental activist, I'm glad that those findings came out after the fire was ignited under the department. But I think it's worth considering that in an example like the United States, where at the moment the question as to, by not pursuing climate policy domestically, what do we lose? The answer at this stage would be very little. The very threat of some sort of loss of competitiveness, however inappropriate it is to define that for a country, I think has a leverage role that's quite significant. Now, the one point that I'll be taking home with me that I think is absolutely critical and that I hope negotiators can take with them is that border carbon adjustment is expensive compared to subsidizing abatement in exporter countries. And those exporter countries would include the South Africas of this world. But I want to reinforce the point about competitiveness being a very strange thing to apply to countries. I did the work comparing electricity prices. South Africa is just going through a massive increase in electricity prices, really a correction compared to underpricing historically. And the reality is when I plotted the World Economic Forum competitiveness rating compared to electricity and just compared South Africa to its peers in the BRICS group, the countries that were more competitive than South Africa under that rating system had higher electricity prices, Indochina and Brazil. The only country that had a lower electricity price also had lower competitiveness, and that was Russia. And I think the relationship between electricity and carbon pricing is very close in that regard. I mean, we heard it from the previous presentation as well from Peter that this is one of the areas where really it's a realistic proxy to look at. So that competitiveness debate on the evidence does fall apart a little. Equally, I think a very important point was made that border carbon adjustments might help for individual exporting company profits or domestic company profits competing against importers, but not necessarily for growth. And this was borne out by some work by the South African Treasury around proposals for a carbon tax in South Africa. And that found that the carbon tax could potentially be positive for growth, has a positive GDP impact, if the carbon tax take was the revenue was channeled towards investment. So effectively, the carbon tax becomes a vehicle for forced savings. South Africa has very low savings rates, and in that respect, carbon tax can actually be pro-growth. So it really comes down, in many cases, to the design. An interesting point as well is that in terms of the availability of things like scrap steel, South Africa at the moment is considering an export tax on scrap steel, because all this steel is leaving the country at the moment. Now, those are some general remarks, but then I want to make one or two points that end up in a very specific proposal that I'd like to hear from the experts here. It was really nice working on a paper and having all the people I reference in the paper in one room. So I'd want to make some general points that end up in a recommendation. We heard from the previous panel now. To some extent, I'd agree with some of these points. That border carbon adjustments are divisive. They sow mistrust. That they're impractical in some cases. They're certainly impractical for iPods. But we've heard that we are dealing here with much more basic, trade-exposed, energy-intensive commodities. And that they're very much a symptom of a failure of the multilateral system, both in the case on UNFCCC and WTO, and I guess specifically the Doha round. So they're not an ideal thing, but I hope that we can see also some of the potential in an instrument like border carbon adjustment. We heard from Aaron the question about what is really effective, and effective being interpreted in respect to environmental outcome, the leakage outcome. But I want to urge us to consider one further aspect of what is effective. Is there a possibility for border carbon adjustments, despite its not very proud history and origins, for border carbon adjustments to actually fulfill the role of driving us towards a multilateral solution, a multilateral agreement? Is there any space for border carbon adjustments to do that? And I'll make some suggestions as to how that might be possible. One of the issues is, and we heard about this as well from WRI, that we seem to live in this very binary world where it's either all trade or it's all climate. And I think the negotiations themselves have been hijacked by this reality as well. It's all rich versus all poor, when in reality there's this group in the middle, the growing countries, or the NICs, which are somewhere in the middle. And then there's also not uniformity between rich countries. There are those that are strong on the multilateral system and those that have skewed it over time. So, and I think one of the features for me, one of the tragedies of negotiation to date is that we focus so much on the differentiated responsibility that we failed in many cases to identify what our common responsibility is. And for me, a large part of the common responsibility is putting a price on carbon. Regardless of whether rich countries or poor countries, if we accept that poor countries cannot undertake carbon emissions limits, because in some way it constitutes a limit on growth, then still they can pursue the economic solution, which we know is critically about bringing into the system externality costs. So putting a price on carbon doesn't mean that you have to then put some sort of cap on. Also, at the same time, how you use the revenues from carbon taxes is very much a sovereign issue. It's up to nations themselves to decide how they want to use those revenues. And so my specific proposal is for some sort of multilateral agreement that states the following: that we as parties agree to exempt countries that have a certain minimum price on carbon from border carbon adjustments. We all agree that border carbon adjustments are not the first best option. We're looking at them, and I think guidance on how they should be best implemented is absolutely critical in avoiding an overload of the WTO system and general mistrust into the future. But this sort of mechanism has a number of implications. It basically falls under the category of what Aaron identified as exemptions on the basis of adequate national policy, so adequate in terms of a certain carbon price. What it does is not only encourages countries like South Africa who are looking at a carbon price domestically to pursue that and to be rewarded to an extent. It's almost turning around I prefer the word leverage to punishment, by the way. It's turning around a bit of that equation. It's saying that by taking on a carbon price, you're preempting the rest of the world from leveraging that sort of measure on you. At the same time, it does act as a measure of sanction on countries like the US, for example, who've not participated in the multilateral process to date, or certainly haven't participated to the same extent as the EU and other developed countries. Not to say that the threat of border carbon adjustments on US exports would necessarily make a huge impact on US growth or competitiveness. But it gives US policymakers an additional tool to say, not only do we know that green growth is an engine of growth into the future, and therein lies the carrot, but there's also the stick, however small the stick, one that can be used against us. And I think that sort of thinking about also how we can shape this undesirable issue of border carbon adjustments into a tool for driving towards our ultimate goal, which is really a much more multilateral approach, is maybe one further angle that we can consider. I'll leave my remarks at this point and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Pete, and thanks to the entire panel for what I think was a good set of complementary discussions. Some of the questions that Pete raised, I think, will be addressed by panel members in response eventually. And at the end of the question period, I'll ask each of the panelists to come back for a couple of minutes to respond to things they've heard from the other panelists. But first, I think we've talked for long enough, and I think it's time to hear some questions from the floor and have some discussion. I'll take 3 or 4 questions grouped together and then get whichever panelists feel like responding to them to respond. If you could, in posing your question, identify yourself and your institution, that would be helpful for those of us that, well, certainly for us that can't see you because we have a couple of very bright lights shining in our eyes up here. I'll take this, Haro here.
Yeah. Haro van Asselt, University of Oxford. I have a few questions, but I'll try to be very brief to basically the whole panel. The first one is following up on Aaron's presentation, and it's about the issue of the forum of discussing border carbon adjustments. And I think how the problem can be framed, and I think Jake showed that very well in his presentations, I think it shows that we need to start with an informal dialogue first. And something like this, an informal dialogue among researchers, is very useful. But my question is, how can we connect this to the intergovernmental processes, both within the WTO and within the UNFCCC? So do you see some potential, for example, to linking up with the Committee on Trade and Environment, or, for example, with the discussions on response measures here in Durban or in next year? The 2 other very brief questions are, first of all, for Jake, about comparability of non-carbon pricing policies. And I know you've written on this in the past, but can you maybe give any idea in terms of the methods of how to take into account non-pricing policies like technology R&D or energy efficiency standards, and how they could be taken into account in the comparability assessment? And then finally, with regard to sanctions, I think I also don't like the term punishment that much, and I would prefer leverage. But I think the distinction here is that between the removal of a benefit versus the imposition of a cost. And you can actually take this argument further and talk about sanctions that are completely unrelated to the climate policies, which basically are similar to sanctions that are imposed against Iran or Syria. And would you think that this is a useful tool for climate policy if really it shows that everything that we're doing is not adding up to enough?
Thank you. Good set of questions. We'll move to the back to Vasily.
My question is to Jacob. If I understood correctly, you said today we see bilateral trade disputes because of a vacuum in multilateral rules on climate or in WTO. I mean, I couldn't quite understand what you meant there. And my real question is, you think if we had rules, we would not have had disputes because, and do these disputes really are climate disputes, or are they something else, the disputes that you are referring to? First of all, tell us which disputes you are referring to then.
Thank you. I'll take one more question. Tom?
Thank you. Tom Brewer, Schuller Foundation Fellow in Germany. I want to pick up quickly on Pete's concluding comments. The possibility of framing the issue a little more positively, particularly with regard to leverage. And always remember that the point is to increase participation and or compliance in some international climate regime. And that's a positive goal. And then secondly, to link whatever sanctions, we'll call them, to link whatever sanctions there are somehow to the domestic political economy of the target. And here's where I think he's right on target. Finally, I would, I guess, remind us all that basically this is the way the WTO dispute settlement process works. I'm a little reluctant to say that in the presence of so many WTO specialists and Secretariat members here, but I mean, basically, the country that loses a WTO dispute is making itself vulnerable to sanctions in its most vulnerable places. If the U.S., in the Bush administration, when the U.S. lost a dispute case, the sanction was that, as I recall, orange exports from Florida, the president's brother's state, were picked as the target. And so my question is anybody given any thought to how you could set up the system to in a very focused, nuanced way to sort of get inside the political economy of the country whose participation and compliance you're trying to get?
Thank you. I'll stop here, take another round of questions, but first I'll give the panelists some chance to answer them. Jake, why don't you start? I think there were a couple directed at you.
Thanks, Aaron, and thanks for those great questions. Let me start by qualifying what I at least should have said about the relationship between the absence of a multilateral agreement from the UNFCCC or the WTO on the relationship between trade and climate and these bilateral disputes. What I meant to say was that in the vacuum of us negotiating rules about what that relationship should be, bilateral trade disputes are going to begin to interpret and articulate those rules, at least as they apply to the countries that are involved in those disputes and the policies and measures that are being challenged. Whether if we had a conclusion of the Doha round that included some articulation on the relationship between MEAs and the WTO rules, or a conclusion of the round of negotiations under the UNFCCC that said something about response measures would generate more or fewer disputes, I don't know. But my point was, where are the rules going to come from in that vacuum that has been created by the failed multilateral negotiating process? The disputes, Aaron referred to some of these as well, this growing catalog of disputes that we see as arising with measures that are put in place, at least with some justification linked to climate change. So the challenge of the feed-in tariff, the Ontario feed-in tariff that included a domestic content requirement is an example of that. The various challenges that the United States has started with regard to Chinese subsidies related to the export of solar and now wind technology, the pending disputes, potential disputes around EU labeling of Canadian tar sands on the basis of their carbon footprint. That kind of set of measures that are now being put in place with more or less a degree of climate policy justification behind them are the disputes that we're seeing and are anticipating. The question about equivalence and comparability and adequacy, or that word that seeks to capture what it is that the policymakers in the importing country are trying to identify and encourage in terms of the policymakers in the exporting country, can be applied at different levels and stages in the design of a border carbon adjustment. So you can, as Aaron suggested, you can decide on a country-by-country basis which countries you're going to exempt from the scheme. By a number of different standards. You can look at the quality of the policies that are put in place. You can look at the cost of carbon within that economy. You can look at their status as, for example, a developed or developing country, or a country that has signed up to a multilateral agreement, or a country that's in compliance or not in compliance with a multilateral agreement. So there's that first stage at which you're assessing comparability or adequacy. And that's at the country level. Then some people have proposed that you look at the sectoral level. So if the country is in, it's going to be applied to the scheme. Should we look at particular energy-intensive sectors and exempt out products from a covered country, but from a sector that has policies applied to it that are of a relatively high standard? So the EU ETS aviation scheme has the potential to identify schemes in other countries from which flights are departing that might have an equivalence to the EU aviation rules, and those would exempt out activities within that particular sector. But if the country is included and the sector is included, then you're down to a product-by-product assessment of whether or not that particular product should bear the additional cost at the border. And that's where you get into these assessments around process and production methods. Does that particular bar of steel emerge from a manufacturer that is more carbon intensive than the industry average, or by whatever other means? But this really is the nub of all of these are at the nub of the effectiveness and the fairness of the policy that's being applied, and reflect the value judgments of the importing country and the legislators that are designing that policy as to what they are trying to encourage through the use of that particular measure.
Thanks, Jake. Why don't we just move down the panel? Don't feel obliged to answer all the questions, certainly, or any of the questions if you don't feel applied to. I'm trying to encourage more dialogue and more questions from the audience, but Pete, I know there was one at least directly.
I'll certainly answer any questions that start with, I fully support the position. I think it was interesting the other day, I was trying to explain to a journalist around the Kyoto Protocol, and what sanction was there to not meeting your targets under the Kyoto Protocol. It's that you have to do more in the next commitment period. What commitment period? And I think in terms of there is a question around the teeth of what we've done multilaterally. I think in terms of a unilateral approach, the real question is can we avoid it? Certainly, if you design it properly so it's WTO compatible, then it does come down to just that point, the removal of a benefit. That if you don't price carbon, it's effectively a subsidy. And the design issues, if done properly, it's just simply something that we couldn't avoid. And I think that's why people got really scared in South Africa and elsewhere because of Waxman-Markey. Just another point is, I think an exemption based on anything other than a prior engagement or proof that there was some sort of largely a prior arrangement may end up violating GATT. So it's understandable that you identify, below de minimis or LDC, but it's the issues around what GATT prescribes, I think, continue to be important.
Okay, let me just do this one briefly on the question about sanctions. Yes, sanctions are a useful tool. They've been applied in many circumstances. They're also, I think, they're seen as a very aggressive approach to dealing with this problem. Maybe there would be an appropriate role for using sanctions if things really got out of hand, but I think that it's not really the first choice that diplomats would want to to pursue. Probably sanctions should be pretty far down the list. The other thing is that sanctions, in terms of effectiveness, from what I've read, it's a mixed bag. It has to be accompanied by many different other measures, talks or other restrictions, in order to actually have effect. And of course, you'd expect it to be more effective on a country which is small and open to trade than a large closed economy, for example. So these are the things that might call into question the kind of use of sanctions in order to leverage a reaction or response in some way. And then I wonder how sanctions as well would fit in with WTO law, whether or not that would be something that would fly or not. Probably not. And I wanted to ask a question to actually some of the panelists, if I'm allowed to do that. Yeah, so this is just basically going to this issue of comparability of efforts. It was also raised by the audience. So I think I didn't really make it clear enough in my presentation, but one of the things that is going to be extremely difficult to do is to actually understand the comparability of efforts being undertaken. I mean, there are, as I said in my presentation, any difference between countries is enough to motivate a difference in terms of the way you price carbon or the way you regulate carbon. So factoring in the historical emissions, factoring in population, factoring in all these different things, trying to sort out a level of engagement or effort on regulating climate is going to be very difficult, which then calls into the whole question: how do you benchmark effort? How do you benchmark the adjustment? And Peter, you said, if I may ask you a question, you were talking about using the lowest benchmark. How do you justify that? What are you trying to do when you say that, and what's your motivation for it? Thanks.
Thank you, Mark, I think. An earlier question from the University of Oxford was about forums, and I've done a lot of work over the last few years with climate strategies and other people on sectoral approaches, and you come down again to these few key sectors, and to my mind they are, until we can sort out these few key sectors, they will continue to act as a potential block on a wider agreement and hold everything back. And you've only got a few of them, and it's steel, cement, aluminium, and maybe a couple of others. And if you look at the sort of the history of the UNFCCC at having meaningful sectoral level discussions on any of those sectors, there's nothing at all. And so this particular forum, UNFCCC, doesn't really have anything to offer, to my mind, on that issue. If you go into industry associations and the international industry associations, such as OECD Steel Committee, then you'll find most of the world's major producing countries, represented by their governments, often supported by their industries. That particular committee invites all the big non-OECD players as well. They all understand their industry, they all understand the trade impacts, they all understand subsidies. They're weaker on the environment and climate side, but at least they're expert in the issue and are thinking in informed terms about what could happen with those sectors. And to my mind, that's the next set of forums to convince to have these discussions. It's not UNFCCC particularly, or maybe not even WTO. It's these more industry-led groups, or groups that are talking about industry, and they're the ones who are also pushing the protocols and the data collection and so on and so forth. So I'll answer that one. I sort of skipped Mark's question because it was far too difficult, but I think myself and Aaron have had an ongoing discussion over the years about whether we're really looking here at a problem with a few sectors that can be sorted out and that those sectors should get somehow equal treatment, or whether by, for instance, a country doing something really good on their forestry sector, therefore their steel sector would be exempt from any requirement to put in a carbon price or to reduce its emissions because some other part of that economy has done it already. My own view is very much on the former side, that the reality here is at the sectoral level, not at the national level from my perspective. And so we focus again on those few key sectors, try and make some progress and see where that takes us.
I'm going to abuse my position as chair and step into my position as presenter to answer some of these. To follow up on Peter's point, I mean, that paradox is illustrated by an example where, let's say, Indonesia takes strong action nationally on climate change, but they decide to do it by acting in the forestry sector. They don't address their steel sector, for example. And then the U.S. Experiences leakage into the steel sector of Indonesia. Does the U.S. have a right, or is it appropriate for the U.S. then to apply border carbon adjustment to Indonesia's steel sector? It is experiencing leakage, but at the national level, Indonesia has chosen to not focus on the steel sector. That's the paradox, and it's something that within the drafting group we've debated for quite some time and are still batting around. Haro's question on forum, I think Peter's right. First, you have to get wider discussion within some of these other technically expert forums, but eventually, once you've got the perfect product, of course that never happens, but there has to be feed-in to the international fora, to the CTE, which is absolutely the right place to be discussing what is appropriate in terms of climate, trade-restricting climate actions. And also, we would hope that good practice guidance would inform dispute settlement. That may be a high hope. And certainly we would hope that it would inform future negotiations once the Doha negotiations are completed and settled. May we live to see that. And in the UNFCCC, absolutely, if there is a permanent forum created for response measures, that's exactly the right place to take the finished product of this kind of a drafting group, plunk it on the table and say, what do we think about this sort of a thing? With respect to comparability of non-price policies, just a quick note, the OECD Environment Directorate is doing some really interesting work in this area, building on the Australian effort in the lead up to the imposition of the carbon pricing in Australia, trying to standardize the idea of comparability of non-price efforts, and they'll be coming out with that sometime soon. They're applying it to other countries and other sectors. Very interesting work. Vasily asked, are these climate disputes? And in most cases, they're not. It's straightforward protectionism. So when China restricted its exports of raw materials, there was, I'm going to go on a limb here. I'm not a politician, I can speak bluntly. There was no environmental motivation there. It was about creating a domestic industry. It was about favoring the relocation of processing industries to China, retaining more value added in China. There was no environmental motivation to that whatsoever. However, we do have as another example, the Ontario feed-in tariff with the domestic content requirement tacked on. The domestic content requirement looks very much like industrial policy. It's designed to create industry within Ontario, and that's an economic motivation. But the reality is so complex and nuanced because, what you're trying to create in the best world, you're trying to create new innovators, new competitors in a sector which is producing technology which we desperately need to address one of the most global problems we're facing today, climate change. So there's this intermeshing where it's not easy to disentangle what the motivations are. Are they environmental or are they economic? They are both. And this is a problem for WTO dispute settlement because if it is an environmental motivation, we can go to Article 20, we can find a justifiable rationale for accepting the application of the rules. If it's an economic motivation, we can't. So it's a complex reality. I can't answer the question, really. On the, I can't read my own writing. Pete's question. Oh, sanctions, sorry. Several people talked about sanctions, how you might define them most effectively. And Haro was quite right. If you're really looking for sanctions, if you're looking for border carbon adjustment to act as a sanction, there's no reason particularly to focus on climate-related sectors. You pick a sector which is most painful to the exporting country, and that may be climate-related. It may be related to the industries you're talking about, but it probably isn't. It's probably something else. We actually ruled out sanctions as a motivation. As I said, we picked leverage as our favorite. We ruled out sanctions as a motivation primarily because we didn't see it as an effective policy tool, as Mark said in his intervention. But the problem was it's such a divisive tool to put in place. We really saw it potentially as poisoning the international climate negotiations and poisoning the atmosphere for multilateral cooperation on trade and on climate to put these kinds of things in place as a lever, as a stick. So we thought best to shy away from that kind of application. I think we have time for one more round of questions. If they're succinctly put and succinctly answered, I'll take 3 or 4 questions, starting with the gentleman in the back.
Working. Thank you very much. Nicholas Walters from the World Steel Association. Peter, thank you very much for your presentation on steel on our behalf. I just wanted to sort of make a couple of quick points. One is obviously, in terms of sectoral approaches, it is a little bit chicken and egg. You know, does the UNFCCC set the framework first, and then you talk about sectoral approaches later? And then, of course, you have to consider the fact the OECD, of course, is not representative globally, where UNFCCC is. So there are all sorts of issues there which don't make it quite as straightforward. But I think you're absolutely right that the Steel Committee in the OECD, you know, has a body of knowledge which really should be tapped. I share that view. Just on the very quickly on the four methods of reducing emissions you put on your slide. I mean, obviously, you know, on the open hearth, you know, we're down to less than 1% in the world now. It's pretty irrelevant and will vanish within the next 10, 15 years, predominantly. Only 2 or 3 nations left use that. Scrap, you know, it's all about availability, and more steel is made, you know, the more scrap becomes available, in which case more often you can use electric arc. But I think the one you missed, and I think it's the key one, is actually lighter, stronger, better steel, so you use much less for the same product. You know, if you, God forbid that we would ever have to, but if you rebuilt the San Francisco Bridge today, you'd be using sort of 50% of the steel you used before. And that, of course, passes it on down into the use phase. So just a few thoughts.
Thank you. I have Mahesh over here.
My question was to Peter and also for the panelists in general. One of the issues that you have to consider when you're comparing countries is indirect emissions. Now, why would you want to penalize a country that, because of natural endowment, has to rely on coal, and another country, let's say Brazil or Canada, has rich hydropower, and that actually reduces its indirect emissions for a lot of the sectors? So when you're looking at comparability of efforts, couldn't those kind of factors be taken into account? The other thing is, what would prevent a country in the UNFCCC negotiations from saying, look, we are discussing the Green Fund, we are discussing technology mechanism, what prevents me, if I am faced with sanctions, from putting these sectors on the table and said, look, why don't we countries get technology to bring our steel sector up to the best, standards, and once we do that, once that happens, then we can start putting in place some measures. So that could actually feed back into the UNFCCC, saying that, look, we don't have the technology, we don't have the money at the moment, but if that comes in to these sectors, that's fine. And if you're just talking about energy-intensive sectors, maybe we just focus on these sectors as a priority. So could China, India, some of these countries put that on the table? Just some thoughts.
Thank you. Over here to Marcus.
Yes, thank you, Aaron. In the program, you also talk about aviation levies, and I was just wondering whether you had ideas what the EU should be doing instead of pursuing a unilateral approach, given that there's such widespread resistance and some would call it abuse in other fora. So a distinct lack of progress on climate issues. Will anything outside the established fora actually work?
Last question goes to Dale.
Aaron, you mentioned that the first question should be effectiveness. It's an old debate, effectiveness and efficiency, but car scrapping schemes were effective in giving a boost to the car industry, but they were extremely expensive and certainly realized today that that was not an appropriate use of taxpayers' money in terms of the results. I mean, some countries it was more expensive than others. Germany, in fact, is one of the worst. But my point in this context is that a couple of times the panelists mentioned that meeting abatement costs would be cheaper than border carbon adjustment. So have you thought about this in your equation? My second question is very technical, really, to Peter. You mentioned quickly that you find the WBSCD protocol to be appropriate for measuring GHG emissions, but is this the product or is it the supply chain? And if it's the latter, it really comes with Mahesh's question that was just posed about how far down into indirect emissions do you go, scope 2, scope 3, et cetera?
Thank you. I think in light of the time we have left, which looks about 8 minutes, if Adriana's around here, she can give me a nod one way or the other. I'll have each of the panelists give us about a 2-minute summary of whatever's on their mind. It may be a response to a question from the audience. It may be in response to what they heard from other panelists. It may be just their impressions of Durban. So you have 2 minutes to be interesting, and we might as well work our way back from Jake. You have the floor.
Let's see. Well, I think I would respond briefly to your questions, not being able to come up with anything interesting that's happening on the other side of town, at least not at the moment, which is, how do you build both fairness and effectiveness into the regime in such a way that takes into account national circumstances? I think it has been hoped that the multilateral process would at least provide us some of the answers to that question, so that whatever commitments that countries could agree mutually would, in a way that's not dissimilar to Annex B of the Kyoto Protocol, take into account differences in national circumstances when assigning the different amounts of carbon budget that each country could bear, and that would then provide the benchmark for whether they're complying with that particular level of obligation, as to whether the level of effort was sufficient, or instead you should adjust against it. It becomes much more complicated, and I have to defer to Peter and others that have been working on this part of the guidelines as to why they arrived at this conclusion when you move from a national level assessment to a sectoral level assessment, for the very reasons that have just been described. At least the way in which the Kyoto Protocol and potentially future climate change regimes have evolved, they allow a country a great deal of flexibility as to how they meet that 8% target. So if Brazil chooses to do it through improvements in sustainable forestry management, they would be in compliance with that obligation, even if they continue to use a highly coal-intensive or fossil fuel-intensive way of producing steel. And if your importer is adjusting on the basis of that sector or that product, then that may be considered to be an unfair adjustment when you look at the standards that have been set by the international regime. So there's still this open space in which unilateral efforts are going to try to aim towards effectiveness in a context where there isn't any multilaterally agreed standard. And what's fair and what's effective under those circumstances is very, for me, very difficult to gain a real good perspective on.
I think at the first point, the problem is that it's very hard to avoid these border carbon adjustments. I don't think we can stop them to the extent that they're designed. If they are designed to be WTO compatible, they can and possibly will happen, even though they're not currently flavor of the month. The second point is that the ideal is still some sort of agreement that preempts a horrible fallout from that route from happening. And that's an agreement that should ideally be an agreement on how and when is it appropriate, or what would be a positive basis for exemption, so that we can get it out of the way in one way or another. The final one is that this certainly must be complemented by a package that deals with technology and finance, maybe bundled up in some way together. And that, for me, one of the biggest losses, if we were to lose the KP, would be around the flexible mechanisms, which try and achieve exactly that.
Okay, so I think that one of the things that has struck me through the questions and the presentations is that, we can talk about the effectiveness of border carbon adjustments. We could talk about benefits and costs and try to be rational about this. But sometimes approaching these issues from a completely sort of rational way is maybe not, this is not the entire story. And I think, Pete, you made that point when you described sort of the fire that was lit under your agency's behinds when they heard about border carbon adjustments. And this just helped get a little momentum going. This is an important thing that a lot of formal analysis has a hard time getting. But anyway, my point is that we can look at the effectiveness, the strengths, and the benefits of different of these response measures. And I think that on the benefit side of it, we've identified that yes, BCAs might be effective in reducing leakage, addressing competitiveness concerns, and leveraging. I'm using that word now. Leveraging a response in the dirty exporter. There would be some costs involved. There would be restrictions in trade. There might be some sort of goodwill costs and so forth, which are harder to put numbers to. But there's also opportunities that could arise, like the one that Pete mentioned. But I think that if you start to cut these different aspects across whether or not it's a unilateral benefit, whether it's a benefit just for the individual country, or whether it's something that's going to take us closer to regulating the global climate more effectively, then things become a little bit more clear about the kind of role that border carbon adjustments might have. Most of the benefits that you'll see for these measures really do play, as Aaron pointed out, into the sort of mercantilist interest, the sort of protecting your domestic interests category. The benefits of border carbon adjustments, even though there might be some when it comes to the multilateral regime, they are weaker in nature than what you'll see at the unilateral level. That's all. Thanks.
Okay, 3 questions in 10 seconds. To respond to Mahesh and Dale, we'd put a boundary around the plant and include the electricity coming in and the other energy coming in, and that would be about it for the scope. And then I'm delighted World Steel Association's here. They've set up the data frameworks and the stuff that everybody, I think, can benefit from now. And I take the points very much about the life cycle approach. And when we look at these sectors and about how they could reduce their overall carbon footprint going forward, then even if we're not talking about BCAs, perhaps we're talking about technology development instead. There still needs to be forums and groups of interested and informed people who can help decide how in the longer term we can get a much more efficient steel sector, both on the production side and on the downstream side. So we look forward to continuing that dialogue.
Thank you. I'm getting the red flag from Adriana, so this will be necessarily short, but I think that the take-home messages from me start with the same one Pete put to you. Hard to avoid border carbon adjustment or these kinds of trade restrictive response measures, and I think the aviation levies are a perfect example of that. We had the ICAO had years and years and years to take action and did not, and therefore you see what came out of the EU, right? And if you ask me what the EU should have done, I think they probably should have done exactly what they did do. So hard to avoid that kind of thing, and it's unfortunate. The first best solution is not that, but here we are. But then the second thing is it's hard to get it right when you actually put it into practice. And I think the whole panel has been about how to get it right. Dale's question goes even more fundamentally to whether we should be doing it at all or whether there are alternatives that are more effective. And I have to say we haven't looked at that yet. Our mandate that we gave ourselves we thought was difficult enough just to examine how to do this right instead of asking what, across the vast panoply of measures, whether this is the right measure to put in place, because we assumed the people would be doing it without having made that actual assumption. So the next item of business after we complete this one and successfully draft this guidance is to go on to examine the broader questions you raised. In closing, let me thank the panelists and the audience for an excellent discussion. Thanks again. Looking forward to the next.